Welcome back. In the last session, we finished up the first book of the Bible, Genesis. Genesis showed us a picture of what God wanted the world to look like. And there were a few things in there that we talked about a little bit. Namely, the breath of God is what makes people alive in the first place. God wants intimacy between the human beings and God. God also wants human beings, plural, to be together in community. And so he brought Adam and Eve together and told them to have children, and they would have children, and you'd end up with a city. On top of that, there was the physical world that God intended us to enjoy. God wanted us to experience pleasure in that physical world. And there was work to be done, and that work was meant to be fulfilling, not the drudgery that many of us experience these days. Well, all that fell apart when Adam and Eve ate the fruit that God told them not to eat. And what God wanted no longer existed. So God eventually chose a man named Abraham and told Abraham unconditionally, no matter what you do or what you don't do, I'm going to make you a blessing to all nations. And specifically, God basically promised Abraham, I'm going to use you, Abraham, to restore everything to what I intended. So there were descendants as part of that promise. There would be land for those descendants to live in, and all the nations of the earth would be blessed through them. Well, Abraham had, several children, but the storyline goes through Isaac. And Isaac had twins, Esau and Jacob. And this promise to Abraham got passed to Isaac and then to Jacob. Jacob, his name was changed to Israel, but he's still referred to mostly in the Bible as Jacob, even though his name was changed. So Jacob, or Israel, had 12 sons, and those sons ended up moving the whole family to Egypt. And that's where we left off. So we're picking up now with the book of Exodus. The people are in Egypt, and they've grown a lot. In 400 years, that can happen. I've actually created a little spreadsheet type thing where I assumed a certain number of children per family over, if people live to be 70, 80 years, if that's the lifespan, how many children would they have to have in order for the numbers here to be accurate. And it's not all that much. I think it was, Jacob had 12 sons. I think the number was around 6 children per family, somewhere in that range. And that's pretty much what the text says. The people grew, they multiplied. They took God's original commandment very seriously. Go be fruitful and multiply. And they ended up, the Bible says here, the sons of Israel, or Jacob, were fruitful and increased greatly and multiplied. They became exceedingly mighty, which means numerous, basically, so that the land was filled with them. And that would be the part of Egypt where they were kept, they were given that part of the land. And they grew so much that they became a military threat to the Egyptians. Not so much that they would rise up and try to take over Egypt, but Egypt had a very good, strong, well-developed army. They would pretty much just defend Egypt. But if somebody with another army came in to fight against Egypt, and they came across these, thousands upon thousands and thousands of Hebrews of fighting age, they could very easily say, hey, fight with us, we'll take over Egypt, we'll split the land, whatever. It really, it would be a genuine threat to the Egyptians. And so the Egyptians decided, hey, we need to really put them in their place. They took them as slaves, and these slaves then in Egypt were being beaten, they were mistreated, eventually their children would be put to death, and what ended up happening, it backfired on the Egyptians. So the Egyptians would make the lives miserable for these Hebrew slaves. Guy would come home from the fields, wife would come home from the fields, and the husband and wife would get together. How was your day? Oh, it was horrible. They were beating me. They did this. They did that. How was your day? Oh, the same. I'm sore. I've, all this hard work. And oh, my poor honey. And they would massage each other's backs. And next thing you know, 9 months later, there's another child. And they kept multiplying. So the whole strategy there sort of backfired on the Egyptians. And so the Pharaoh, the ruler of all Egypt, decided we need to get rid of this threat. And we'll do that by here's the plan. So the Hebrew people, the woman would have midwives when they were giving birth, right, to help with the birth process. So these midwives would be there when the Hebrew women were ready to give birth. And Pharaoh said, listen, I'm commanding you as king of Egypt, if the baby is born, when the baby is born, if the baby is a boy, kill it. If it's a girl, let her live. And that was it. But the midwives wouldn't do it. Now, the Egyptians hated, despised Hebrew people, right? Not just these slaves, all Hebrew people, all people living in the land of Canaan, the Canaanites, and for various reasons. A lot of it hygienic. If you're a shepherd, you're out following the sheep around the field. You smell like the stuff you step in when you follow them, and you don't really have any reason. You're not going to business meetings, so you don't have any reason to get up and shower in the morning. So they smelled. In Egypt, there was apparently, from what I've read, there was a problem with lice, and so the Egyptians, it's one of the reasons they would shave all the hair off their bodies, was to help with that problem. But the Hebrews, they're just out in the fields all day. They're covered in hair. They grow their beards long. They're, just uncultured, smelly, disgusting people that the Egyptians hated them, right? Despised them. And so these midwives used that to actually protect the children. So the Pharaoh found out that babies were being born, and the male children, the male babies, were not being killed. And Pharaoh called all the midwives and said, I ordered you to kill the male babies. What's going on? And the Hebrew woman said, well, these Hebrews, these Hebrew women, they're just animals. I mean, you wouldn't believe it. They're out in the fields working, time to give birth. They spread their leg, boop, out comes the baby, and they get right back to work before we even get there. So we couldn't do anything about it. And I, this is what they said to Pharaoh. I just picture Pharaoh just going, whatever. So he issued a decree, a law. Anybody who's, if you're a Hebrew, if you just are a fellow Egyptian seeing a Hebrew give birth, but any Hebrew children being born, whoever is there, whether you're the parent or not, you need to kill the child. And very specifically, Pharaoh said you need to throw male babies into the Nile. The woman, the female babies you can keep, right? And why do that? Well, if you do that, you still have half of your slave force after the generation, the current generation passes away and those children grow up. You still have all the females as slaves, but they're not going to be, marrying and having children with Hebrew men. And so they'll either just stay slaves until they're old and they die off, and then you lose your slaves, but the problem is solved, or they intermarry with the Egyptians and just become enculturated, and problem is solved either way. So let the female babies live, but kill the male babies, and within a generation this whole problem will be solved. Well, there was a man and a woman, both from the tribe of Levi. And if you remember from the last couple of sessions, we talked about Jacob and his sons, and Levi was one of the sons. And these two people, they had a child, and the mother in particular saw that the baby was beautiful, and so she hid him. Right? Now, the text says that as though that's something like special, out of the ordinary. Every mother is going to think that about her baby. But we're following the story of this particular child. So this mother saw that he was beautiful, and she did her very best to hide him. As a man, a stereotypical man in many ways, usually when I see babies, they kind of look a bit like Mr. Magoo. And I don't know what my problem is, but that's when I see a baby, it's going to look like Mr. Magoo. Just this really wrinkly thing, just cross-eyed. And when I was, my wife and I were getting ready to have our first child, we're in the hospital, and I'm kind of panicked because I've barely even held a baby before. And, I have a couple of friends who, they got married quite a while before I did, and had children. And my one friend, she said, "Here, hold the baby," and I was like, "No, no, no, I'll break it," I'll break it, and I said it as well. But at one point, she had trusted me that she probably shouldn't have had, but she took the baby and stood up and said, "Oh, I have to get something out of the oven, and here, hold him." And she handed the baby, and I'm just sitting there with this baby, going, "What do I do? What do I do? I'm gonna drop him. I'm gonna break him," and panic mode. So here I am, about to have my first baby, and not having any clue what's going to go on. I did know, I knew a little bit, but like I knew babies' eyes are very weak. The muscles aren't developed, and the eyes kind of go everywhere except where you want them to. But usually the doctor will hand the baby right to the mother, and for some reason, this particular doctor with my first son handed him right to me. And I held my arms out, and the nurse just laid the baby in my arms, and I held him, and I was comfortable. And it kind of surprised me that I was so comfortable. And I looked down, and no exaggeration, for some reason his eyes were just stronger than many babies, but he looked me right in the eyes, locked eyes with me, and just stared at me. And it was like he was thinking, "So you're this daddy thing, huh?" And it just had that kind of connection. I really think that maybe God did that for me to calm me down a little bit, developed his eyes and whatever. Well, I held him. I didn't actually want to stop holding him, but I knew my wife wanted to hold him, so I handed him to her. A little bit later, she needed some rest. The doctors took the baby away for some tests and just said, in a little while, however long it was, you can go visit the baby in the nursery. So I went over, and in this hospital, the nursery, basically there's a door for parents to go in, and then it's a long room, and there's just huge glass windows all along, so people out in the waiting room can actually look in and see the babies, and whoever else is in there walking in, like me. So as I'm walking into the room, I open the door and I'm walking in, and as I'm walking in, I start realizing there are it's bassinets, one after another, with babies in them. And all these people are looking at the babies, and here comes this man walking in who's going to have to look at every single tag to find out which one of these creatures that looks like Magoo is his. And the door shut behind me, and I'm thinking, right, this is going to be really embarrassing and really awkward. Oh, wait, there he is. I looked up, and out of all these Magoos, there was the one that didn't look like Magoo. That was my baby. And it's just such an amazing experience. There's something about your own child that is just, no matter what your child looks like, your child is beautiful. It's a really amazing thing. People used to tell me that there's really no way to explain what it's like to have a baby until you have a baby. Like, you just can't understand it until you have a baby. And I just thought, yeah, whatever, that's a beautiful saying, but whatever. And then it happened to me, and I found that it's true. It's an amazing thing. So here's this couple. They have a baby. She doesn't want to, she's not going to kill this child. This is her son. And now I notice here, this mother or father, they, as far as we know, didn't give the baby a name. They knew this is a male baby, and this baby will have to be thrown into the Nile. Baby will have to be killed. And I don't think they gave it a name because, especially in that culture, your name is your identity. And it's hard enough knowing that your baby is going to be killed, whether you do it yourself or somebody else throws it into the Nile for you. And I can't imagine any of these people actually did it themselves. I don't know for sure, but I can't imagine it. But knowing that sooner or later, Egyptian guards or somebody will walk through and take the baby and throw it in the Nile. If you give it a name, it's going to be that much harder, because now this child is, more, in your mind at least, more of a human being with a full identity. So they didn't name this baby. But the mother, she already had a daughter, and the mother came up with a really ingenious plan. Now, you are required to throw the baby into the Nile. The time came, she knew she couldn't hide the baby. The child's going to end up in the Nile. So she made this like little tiny boat, right, a basket that could float. She tested it, I'm sure, and this is, I'm reading into this a little bit, but I'm absolutely sure she would take little leaves or sticks or something, throw it into certain parts of the Nile, and the Nile was very, very consistent and predictable. And so she would throw a leaf or whatever it was in and just watch exactly where the stream took this thing. And she found just the right place to put these twigs and leaves and pieces of wood in, where it would just float and go right into this little alcove where the Pharaoh's daughter would go and bathe. And she made this basket then and tested it out, made sure it would float, made sure it was okay, put some padding in it, lay the baby in the basket, put the basket in just that exact spot, and sure enough, it floated right down the stream and went just where the current took all the other test things into that little alcove. And she did it right when Pharaoh's daughter, was in there for her bath. And, Egyptians would bathe regularly. She wouldn't have to wait long once she knew it was time. So she was there. And then the Pharaoh's daughter, she heard this baby crying and looked down and saw the basket. And she scooped up the baby and looked the baby right in the eyes. And here's another difference between men and women, right? If a woman comes into a room with a baby, all the other women just flock to the baby and talk about the baby and want to play with the baby and they want to hold the baby. Men come into a room and there's a baby, and the men just kind of say, wow, that's a cute baby. What's the score of the game, right? And so just a whole other different world there between men and women. But here's Pharaoh's daughter, sees this baby, picks the baby up, looks the baby in the eyes, and realizes this is one of those Hebrew babies. Somebody threw her baby into the Nile, just like the law says, and here he is. But she already picked up the baby and looked into its eyes, and it was over. She can't throw this baby back in the Nile, right? It's just not going to happen. So she kind of, brings the baby back to her father, the Pharaoh, and says, I found this out in the field. Can I keep it? Right? I'm sure that was a conversation, right? But before this happens, the baby's older sister, remember this man and woman from the tribe of Levi, they had a daughter already, and she was very young, but she was old enough that she could follow this path. She knew exactly where the baby would go. This was all really well thought out. So she just happened to be there when Pharaoh's daughter picked up this baby, and she started holding the baby and talking and cooing to the baby, and that was the cue, right? The baby's sister, Miriam, she pops up out of the fields and says, "Oh, princess, I know somebody who could nurse that baby for you." And the princess, she's not stupid, right? She catches on right away to what's happening, but she also realizes these people that's a pretty brilliant move, right? So she says, you know what? Yes, go see if you can find somebody to nurse the baby, and I will raise the baby. I'm adopting the baby, but if you can find somebody to nurse the baby, knowing full well that it was the baby's mother, then I'll actually pay her to do it. So instead of having to kill her baby, this woman actually got to be part of raising the child in Pharaoh's household, which is pretty cool. And Pharaoh's daughter named the baby Moses. And the name Moses has a meaning, it's sort of, the meaning is like to draw out. So Pharaoh drew him out of the water, and she named him to draw out, basically, Moses, Moshe. And Moses then is growing up in Pharaoh's household. And, no doubt there was, I'm sure Pharaoh was not too fond of this idea. But Pharaoh's daughter, I suppose, can be pretty convincing, right? I have myself, I have 3 boys and 1 daughter who's quite a bit younger than the rest, and I can tell you she runs the household, and she makes a certain face, and knowing that I'll just melt, right? She abuses that. She'll ask me questions once in a while, and I'll answer, and I'll happen to glance up at my wife, who's saying she's got you wrapped around your finger. So Pharaoh's daughter, I guess, won that argument. And over time, he's just part of the family, right? You don't think of him as that Egyptian, or I'm sorry, that Hebrew. He's just Moses, Moshe. hey, Moses, did you do your homework? And Moses is growing up in the best school, best education system in the area. He's got it made. He's being trained with military training. He's probably going to be trained to be a diplomat to other countries. He's royalty. And his own mother had to have a role in his upbringing, which means he learned all about the Hebrew people and their background. And the Egyptians had many, many gods that they worshipped. Moses would have been learning all about the Egyptian gods and which god does what, how do you worship all these gods, but he also would have known about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, his forefathers. And the Hebrew people were still being treated brutally, and all this horrible stuff is still going on. And at some point, Moses, he's got this really strong sense of justice combined with this, what I would call sort of a righteous anger. He doesn't always think things through before he acts. But that's the situation that he's in. So what does Moses know about the Lord? And what do all these people know about the Lord? And this will be really important moving forward in the book. So I'll take a little time here. Moses and all the Hebrew people alike, they've been in Egypt as a people for 400 years, 430 in total, I believe it was. So 400 years for round numbers. They knew the Egyptians. They would have, I'm sure, learned the Egyptian language as a people, but still spoke their own Hebrew language. They've maintained their own cultural identity, and that's something that being a slave would have helped them to do. In fact, they didn't just assimilate as Egyptians. They didn't assimilate into Egypt. They maintained their own identity as a people. So they would have maintained their language, maintained the stories of their history. And so they would have known things that were passed on. We mentioned that Adam himself would have known several people before he died who directly knew Noah. And, after Noah, Noah's son Shem lived long enough that he could potentially even have met Abraham. So if the ages in the Bible are at all accurate, then it's, the storyline is, it doesn't have to be passed down all that much through all that many people to reach Abraham. So we talked about that a while ago, but the point is, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they had their family history. They probably had liturgical poems and songs that people would write to the Lord, and they would use this when they were worshiping, and they learned about sacrifices and all those things. Well, they would pass that down, and now the people are taken as slaves, but they're still passing these stories down for 400 years, quite a few generations. So what does that mean for them? Well, the worldview all around this whole region was this. There are lots of gods. Everybody understood that there are lots of gods. Nobody questioned it, including the Hebrew people, and Moses himself. Nobody questioned it. There are lots of gods. If two cities are doing battle, the city that wins actually wins because their God is stronger. That was the thinking. If your God is not strong enough, you're not going to win the battle. And, well, isn't it obvious when you have 3 times the number of soldiers and you have better weapons and better strategies for war? Well, the thinking would be, well, we have all that stuff because our God is a warrior God who gave it to us. He made us like that. So, that's really the thinking. Whatever God wins the battle is the stronger God. What we know all about, as a Hebrew person, I would know all about my family's God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and these great promises that he made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But look around. There are over 90 major gods in Egypt who all have set routines. We actually see them regularly doing things. Like there's a god of the Nile, and every year the Nile would flood right to a certain point and then recede. And that allowed the crops to come in, and there was a god overseeing the growth of the crops, and so all these gods were doing their things. Where's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Here we are as slaves, being beaten, even being killed. What's our God doing about it? Right? Nothing. So either our God just deserted us, or he is just no match for these great Egyptian gods. And so that's the mindset, right, for all of the people, including Moses. And God's going to have to really do something to shake them out of that mindset. And so Moses, he grows up in Pharaoh's household. He knows all about the Egyptian gods, the Egyptian way of life. He's really doing well. One day he goes out for a walk and he sees an Egyptian man beating, really severely beating, a Hebrew slave. Now, the Hebrew slave is one of Moses' own people, right? That's his flesh and blood. But Moses has been raised as an Egyptian. But this sense of anger mixed with justice kicks in. And Moses says, what you're doing is not right. And he goes in and he takes out that Egyptian, kills him. Little, that wasn't well thought out, that move there. So he kills this Egyptian, buries him, hides the body, pours, what's that stuff you, I haven't watched the cop shows, I guess, in too long. I forget what you pour on the bodies to make them disappear. But, Moses takes care of it. Everything is good. Goes home. Another day he goes out for a walk and he sees two Hebrew slaves beating each other. They're in this massive, angry fist fight. Moses goes out and steps in between them, and he says, you two are flesh and blood. Why are you doing this to each other? You shouldn't be doing this to each other. And one of them turns to Moses and says, what, are you going to kill me now like you killed that Egyptian the other day? And Moses says, you know about that? And the Hebrew says, yeah, it's all over Instagram. Your face is posted up in the post office. And Moses panics. Now, by now, he's around 40 years old at this point. And he is he's part of this family, Pharaoh's family. They don't see him anymore as that Hebrew, right? Like he's been there for 40 years. He's family. And I'm sure Pharaoh cared about him quite a bit. But Pharaoh was seen as divine being. And if you're Pharaoh, seen as divine, and everybody knows you adopted a Hebrew as your own son, now that Hebrew kills one of us, an Egyptian, well, I'm going to start questioning your divinity, right? I'm not just going to be questioning your ability to lead us well by making decisions like that. I'm actually questioning, did the gods really appoint you here? Do you really have any divinity in you, right? So there's a lot at stake for Pharaoh. Pharaoh has no choice but to kill Moses for the crime he committed. Moses murdered somebody, right? And keep that in mind too, because most of us already know who Moses is before we even get to the book of Exodus here. Most people have heard of Moses at some point in their lives. He murdered, right? And God still is choosing him to do this thing, right? But the point is, Moses knows that Pharaoh has to put him to death, and he just takes off running. And he runs out of Egypt across the desert, which is a very dangerous journey. He ends up in the land of Midian. And when he gets into Midian, he sees a group of girls. One of the roles of women in that day would be to go out in the morning before it's too hot and gather a lot of water from the local well and bring it back. Get as much water as you're going to need for the day. But what would happen is that groups of stronger men, sometimes armed men, would come. They'd let the woman do all the hard work, and then they would kind of gang up on the woman and take all the water and leave. And then the woman have to go back and get more buckets and start all over. And it's just not a pleasant thing to have happen. And the men, like I said, they were probably armed. In general, men would have been able to overpower the woman anyway. There were probably more of them. And you just have to hope that they're only after the water and not anything more than that. Well, Moses is approaching this well. He sees these girls getting water out of the well. And then a group of men ride up to them, and they get off their camels or horses or whatever they were riding. They start harassing these girls. And Moses is approaching, and he sees this happen, and he says, oh no, not while I'm here. And Moses, whatever fighting tactics the Egyptians used, Moses had learned them all growing up in Pharaoh's household. And, I don't know what martial arts he knew, but he took out this whole group of guys, sent them running one man taking out this whole group of guys, and they ran away, and they just weren't a problem anymore. Well, the girls went right back home with their water. And the father said, "You usually take a lot longer than this. How did you get back so early today?" And they said, "Oh, this Egyptian guy, he happened to be there, and he was protecting us from those men who always harass us." And the father looks around and he says, "I have 7 unmarried daughters. You just met an Egyptian who took on a whole group of guys and won, and you didn't invite him for dinner? Go back and get him. Bring him home." So they do. Moses and the father, they get to know each other. They invite him to stay a little bit, and he ends up marrying one of the girls and living there with them, working as a shepherd, which is pretty ironic. Moses was taken from among the slave Hebrew shepherd people to be in the palace, and then he has to run from the palace, and he ends up being not a slave, but a Hebrew shepherd. And every day for 40 years, he'd be following these sheep around, thinking, what was I thinking here? Why did I do that? That was the stupidest thing. I've destroyed my life. I had it made back in Egypt, and here I am following these sheep, right? And he would step in something and be like, "Oh man, I could have been a diplomat. I could have been this." 40 years just absolutely miserable following these sheep around. Well, after this, the Lord appears to Moses, and that's where we'll pick up in the next section.